Welcome to the Genre Hustle, your virtual sci-fi fantasy writers group. I'm Anton.
I'm Jane.
I'm AP.
And I'm Carter.
And today we're talking about horror.
Spooky.
And with us to talk about horror is Erin Brown from our writers group. Thank you for coming, Erin.
Hi.
Thank you for
Erin.
having me. Hi.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I've been with the group for a little over a year, maybe close to 2 years
it?
now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Time flies.
What's up?
Brand new. And I am one of the mostly horror writers. Like most of the stuff I write is like scary, monster, bloody, bitey stuff. So
Bloody bitey stuff.
yeah.
That's
So-
great.
But yeah, that's what I specialize in. I have a lot of fun with that.
Yeah, and Erin was actually had a story in the first volume of Murder Park After Dark, which is a zine that I edit. That first volume came out in, I guess it would have been early 2018. We had a second volume come out this year, 2019. And we're actually open after consulting with my investors and mainly with
Venture capitalists.
Yeah. Mainly with AP, we've decided to open it up to all of you and everyone and us and the whole world for Volume 3. So it's actually open for submissions now. If you go to genrehustle.com, you can find the guidelines and basically what we're looking for and that kind of thing. And we'll be reading through the end of this year, early next year. So if you have a short horror story, you can join Erin and several of our other fellow podcasters in Murder Park Volume 3. So check it out.
Awesome.
I love doing those. They're so much fun.
Yeah. The first one, we actually, we read our stories like together at night in a scary park.
Yes.
In a murder park.
In a murder park.
With scary snacks and like candles. It was
Yeah.
awesome.
What are
Yeah, it was
scary
really
snack? Oh, never mind.
That's season 4.
Wait for it. So before we get into it, I think it's worth sort of stating kind of the definition, because I just said off mic, this is a huge topic.
Yeah.
When we
Yeah,
talk
it's
about
massive.
horror. And AP, you have like just a pretty good list. You started reading it, and I said like, oh, hold on, let's just...
Yeah, I mean, there's subgenres and crossovers and all that. I mean, horror is massive.
Right.
Massive.
I mean...
and we're going to touch on quite a few things in this episode, but we're not going to do a really deep dive. We'll just go through, subgenres. What does horror mean? What does it get to you? And then we'll get into some craft stuff. And then maybe in later seasons, we'll focus in on more specific things.
Yeah, and you even brought up the point before, sort of the idea of long form horror versus the short
Right,
form,
yeah.
and so
So what is horror?
Yes.
Is so a kind of highfalutin way of defining it, but one that it's a quote that I actually really like from Robert Bloch. He's the writer of Psycho before it was made into a movie, and he said horror is the removal of masks.
I love when you read that, because that really does define it. I mean, that really brings it all home, where it's sort of this idea of there's a mystery, there's a reveal, and there's also this sort of what's beneath it. Like there's a reason there's a mask, kind of like that thing is packed with all kinds of meaning.
And so there's actually a more helpful quote that I found too.
Thank you.
By Michael A. Arnzen. He's a Bram Stoker award-winning horror author. He wrote Grave Markings. He says, though it often can and often does revel in the thrilling surprise and disturbing shock of the suddenly revealed, it is more often the case that horror's power lies in seduction. It seduces us into looking at the things that we otherwise wish would remain enshrouded in mystery. It probes into the places where society tells us we should not go. Our fear is balanced against the pleasure inherent to rebelling against the rules. We thrill at doing something our parents and priests and pundits tell us we should not do. We know we shouldn't, but we go there anyway.
That's good. That kind of reminds me of like Brothers Grimm type horror, where it's like kind of a warning, almost like it's like communicating an omen or something, like don't go in the woods or the witch is going to bake you into pie.
Yeah, Erin,
thing.
you were talking about this before we got on mic.
Well, I love the idea of masks because it's not always just removing a mask. Sometimes it's about actually putting one on. And when you have, these fairy tales, like for instance, that were told to kids like a long time ago, why do you not go into the woods at night? Well, it's not because somebody might snatch you or whatever. It's because there might be a wolf, there might be a monster, there might be a goblin. Putting masks on these things to scare you into doing what needs to be done, and or removing masks to expose what's actually there that you need to be avoiding. So I feel like that is one of the reasons why horror is so affecting, because it helps us figure out the world and react or at least interpret the way that we react to things that aren't explicitly explained all the time.
Well, and like people love to be scared for some reason, right? Like,
I thank you for saying that. Yeah, for some reason.
yeah, I don't know if it's like a adrenaline thing, or I've never really been able to like really diagnose it, but like, and I mean, I'm somebody who has like multiple actual anxiety disorders. Like I'm scared of stuff all the time, and I hate it, but I love to like read scary stuff and write scary stuff. I don't know what it is.
I know that a lot of kids read a lot of horror. There's a lot of horror that is explicitly written for kids.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was growing up, there was all the scary stories to read after dark. There was Nickelodeon's Are You Afraid of the Dark? And there was R.L. Stein's Goosebump books, which was just a jillion of them.
Yeah.
And I remember looking back, the theme, it was always very uplifting. No matter what was in the book, it was a monster, it was a ghost or whatever. It was always about a kid who was afraid of something and no one believed them.
Yeah.
But it was the truth. And so the problem they had to overcome was to handle it on their own. Mm-hmm. So they found a way, they overcame their fear, and then they overcame their monster. And then every book over and over again, children are being taught, if something is scaring you, the thing you need to attack is the fear. And the feeling that you need to be completely, have everyone believe you, be always in your corner. If you believe in something, defend yourself, get out there, handle your problem, and, move on. I feel like that echoes with people, like, as they grow up.
For me, I think, I never considered myself a horror reader or writer, but I love ghost stories and I love like the dread side. And we'll talk more about like what that means, I think. But, and I think for me, it's that these stories validate the fears and anxieties that I already feel in my real life on some level.
Absolutely.
Right? And this story tells me, yes, you are right to be afraid. Like, it's a reasonable reaction to some of the stuff that's happening.
And it's like a quarantine fear. Like the stuff in your life that you're scared of, you might not have control over. But if you're reading a story, you're like, the story's going to end. It's not actually happening to you. So it's a way of maybe like experiencing it, maybe learning something, and then applying it to yourself maybe without, getting gutted.
It's like it's a controlled environment.
Yeah, it's the roller coaster.
Yeah, the roller coaster. Exactly.
So
people love roller coasters.
Yeah, so you're not left with the actual monsters. You're left with just the horror of it or the dread of it.
Yeah, but people love haunted houses for like the same reason, It's like, that like everything there
Me
is
too.
gonna, some people.
But I think you hit on it, Erin. It's that tickle. It's that thing where it's fear. It's gonna. You're gonna be scared by this story, and that's that's exhilarating.
It is. And then the release of that fear once the movie is over, once the book is closed, is very cathartic.
Yeah.
Too.
And then you dream about it, and then it's even more scary.
Yeah. Then the nightmares come. Yeah.
It creeps into your
Stays
subconscious,
with you.
and then you're really screwed.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So scary.
I would like I think I've talked about this on the podcast before, but my favorite novel that I've read is House of Leaves, which isn't quite horror. It's definitely horror adjacent. And that book definitely gave me actual nightmares. That's like the only piece of media that's given me like specific actual nightmares. I think that a lot of people have had this experience with this book. And that is like the coolest thing that you could do with like art,
Yeah, right. As a writer, like that's the ultimate accolade, right?
Yeah, it's like, it's really wild and cool.
I think one of the pieces of horror that stayed with me the longest when it comes to actually feeling horror, and it's funny, it's a web comic. It's illustrated, it's really cute, but it's terrifying, and it's called His Face All Red by Emily Carroll. I
love Emily Carroll.
So you never see it coming. No one talks about, and then you go through her, and halfway through you get to a panel where you're like, wait, what just happened?
Yeah.
And then it just gets darker and darker and darker and darker at the end.
Yeah, that's nice.
It's so wonderful, yeah, but it's just and it's unexpected. It's cartoony, very childlike illustrations. It's sing-songy. Some of it is rhyming. You know what I mean? It reads like a children's book, and then the subject matter just gets really
lulls
dark.
You in, right?
Yeah, so it's like playing against the familiar and the unfamiliar being blended in uncomfortable ways.
I mean, was it ever gory? Didn't he really do that a lot? Where it was very kind of like, it was these super dark subjects, but it was so sort of sing-songy that it was like you would
She was, there was blood. There was blood, there were guts, there were bodies. But it didn't happen at the beginning.
Right.
It slowly led you there and you felt it coming. That's the
already
dread.
scared.
It's wonderful. You should check it out.
Yeah, that's one of the things I really love about horror too, is how it lends itself to so many different like media, you know? Like there's web comics and creepypastas, and like sometimes that's the scariest stuff. There was like that thing, I don't know if you
creepy pastas.
Yes.
Yeah, you've never heard of that?
Yes.
Can you explain that for old people?
I'm not. It's basically a kind of, it's usually like a long form blog basically that is a horror story, and you scroll from like the top to the bottom, and like the process of like scrolling through the story and the images is like part of what's so scary. And like it's written like in universe, so it's like the idea is that like a person is actually blogging about something terrifying that happened to them, and it feels very real. There's actually a TV show called Channel Zero where each season is
I've watched
based
Channel
on
Zero.
a creepypasta, which is really cool.
Yeah, it's kind of like urban legends kind of stuff.
I
but like
gotcha.
it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That was always the thing that scared me about Lovecraft, because Lovecraft is always, I found my uncle's old diary and I started reading it, and before I knew it,
It's like, I'm going to kill myself before I finish this letter.
Yeah.
And at the end it goes,
Also, he was very, very careful in particular about his paths into the stories. Like, it was always someone's cousin wrote him a letter about something, and then you met the cousin, and then you met the person,
Yeah, it's
and
very
then
mundane,
you met the
right,
monster.
exactly.
So, like, that dread was building there as well. By the time you hit the horror and the terror, is kind of all in one.
right.
Yeah, he
and you're
builds
doomed
dread,
too.
like-
And you're
the guy's
doomed.
doomed. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
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 So we've kind of talked about dread, horror, and terror a little bit. So let's actually jump into what those mean when we talk about them. I think there's Erin, you actually brought up a good way of defining them.
Yes, I was actually I read someone saying that the beats that you want to hit in order are dread, and then terror, and then horror. And then dread is, oh my gosh, something is going to happen. And then terror is, it's happening. Like punchy right there, you're in the moment. Then horror is, I can't believe that could happen. And then that's supposed to last. So, horror is a genre that is named after the feeling you're supposed to leave your reader with.
Yeah.
After the two worst possible things, right?
Yeah.
You're dreading it, and then there's the terror, and this is the after effect. Like,
Yeah, I've always heard it explained that the dread is like the suspense, the build up. Terror is like the scare, the jump scare. It could be gory, disgusting, or not. And then horror is just the feeling that you get.
Yeah, the lingering image.
But see, I think I prefer stories personally that don't have much terror at all, like Gothic stories. A lot of Gothic stories are really more about revealing the mystery of what had happened, like the terror is in the past, and the horror is when the when the protagonist realizes, oh my God, this is what went down.
But usually in those, there's a small scene where everything clicks, and it's not like someone jumps out at them or someone kills someone else. It's just that like the knowledge clicks together, and that's actually something that Lovecraft does a lot.
and there's
It's
that
not-
turn. It's just
It's a small turn.
It's a small turn, but
boom,
suddenly it went from
and then
being,
it's like, oh my God, this is what's actually
yeah,
going on.
I can't believe this house is actually haunted, or oh my God, the whatever. Yeah.
I wonder if in those instances too, maybe the terror and the horror are switched, because you're going through all the dread and then the horror of what's happening, but you don't understand, and the terror is what you leave your readers with, because it's like it's almost explained, and now in your head that's what's lingering is the question, what just happened.
Yeah, that's
There's a
good
lot
one.
of that in Victorian.
There is a lot of ambiguity in Gothic literature,
Yeah.
where you're like, I think this is what happened, but I'm not sure.
So, I mean, what is Gothic literature? We haven't really talked about like the subgenres of the crossover, but you brought it up, and Erin, you had some things to talk about when it comes to that.
Well, Gothic literature it's a part of the artistic movement, and specifically with the literature, because of what was going on in politics and history at the time. It was just about how you felt if you were on laudanum and you were looking at a really scary, broken down.
I'm on laudanum right now.
Exactly. But we're in this lovely apartment as opposed to like a really scary moor under some thunder and lightning with some broken down castle where you see a flicker of light. Your head is not in those instances. It's like, what could that be? And with the right imagination and a sharp enough quill, you wrote it down what you thought it might be.
So what exactly is Gothic literature? Is that like Bram Stoker or Mary Shelley or both or neither, or
Yeah, both.
Yes.
So the example I have is contemporary, I guess contemporary Gothic. It's John Harwood who wrote The Asylum and he wrote The Seance. And this goes back to what you were saying, Jane, which was in these, the genres or these subgenres, in this case, these books are all dread. You're reading it and it's just the peeling back of the onion and it's, wait, what do you mean? And that can't be. And let me investigate. And it just keeps going. And then there's that turn, AP, like you were saying, like there's that, and then it's all horror because it's, oh my God, I can't believe this thing. And it's not, there's no gore, there's no blood, there's no, but the tension of it is so stirring and so like, and it's 100 little things. And I think that to me, and I guess these are horror. I mean, I consider them horror, but.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, so Gothic is, out of the dark romanticist movement in the 19th century.
Yes, definitely. And it started as a reaction to moving from the spiritual kind of medieval way of looking at life into the scientific, because there was a very hard swing. And the idea of emotions being ungovernable, they became unscientific and they lost meaning. So people who were afraid of things, if you couldn't explain why you're afraid, then what do you have to be afraid of?
Right.
But then that's a really deep question. Like, what is it you're afraid of? Well, I don't know what it is. It's a monster in the closet. I can't see it.
And that's where Mary Shelley, for example, comes in.
Yeah. She was very clever about it too. I mean, she was writing the story that was poking fun at the idea of the rise of scientific minds being, or the scientific way of thinking being eclipsing all spirituality and the unknown. Like the unknown was something to attack or to disregard. So it was like she wrote this story about a science experiment that went really well, too well. And then it went and ate the town and destroyed its creator. And then it asked the question of the creator, basically, if you did your best and it worked in the worst possible ways, what would your reaction be? The reaction would be emotional. It would be illogical and it wouldn't be scientific. So that is the mask that's being removed in that case.
Yeah.
And it's an important question even now, like when we ask what we are trying to make and what we're trying to do, like where is it going to lead and what are you going to do from there? And what does it make you to make these things?
I also think a lot of Gothic is an inversion of the Victorian ideals of domesticity, right? Because in Victorian times, there was this real cult of like your home, and women were supposed to be, the centers of domestic bliss and teach their children and just be pure and have all these sort of virtues attached to women. Men could go off and visit the brothels, and that was
those
fine,
were the good old days.
yeah. Right? But women were supposed to like retain. And I think a lot of Gothic stories that I love sort of subvert that or are speaking to that, and they turn a comfortable house into a prison and into a place that can no longer be trusted to keep you safe.
Yeah, I think that like the imprisonment, loss of control kind of trope is like really powerful and like has like a really long current in horror. Like for example, like some of the Edgar Allan Poe stories that are the scariest to me are like they're all about like somebody who's just like completely has all their agency taken away, like they're a captive and like they didn't see it coming, like Cask of Amontillado or Pit and the Pendulum. Like when I read those stories as a kid, I was like, holy fuck, this is scary. Like it's like still like the scariest thing is like being imprisoned and a captive, either like literally or metaphorically. It's like I think that's like really like gets to the core of a person is like yeah, you have no control over what's going to happen to you and you don't know what it is. That's like the dread, I guess. And then the terror is when the
pendulum starts sweeping,
slicing
when
across
those
your belly.
bricks are going up one by one to wall you in.
Oh my gosh.
And then that was also
so much
the tension building and the visceral nature of like really being able to see and feel what is happening to these characters. Horror really needs to press in that. Like when you're writing horror, you really need to make your reader feel the fear that the character is feeling, because then they're experiencing it and getting lost in that.
So how do you do that? That's a great point. And I totally agree. But what are some craft tips?
So there's this book that I read called Writing and the Body, and it's about horror stories. It's, it talks about Clive Barker and Stephen King and Anne Rice specifically, and it talks about how you have to anchor the world very strongly in the familiar and then twist some bit of it to become unfamiliar, because because that's what's going to cause the tension and the dread building and then the terror. And, when you come to things like with fantasy and science fiction, everything can be very alien. Everything is a new world. It's a new galaxy. It's new technology. So you're not expected to recognize everything. But in horror, you have to recognize most of the world so that you know what is wrong.
Oh, good.
So when someone is stuck in a closet, I'm just going to give an example. Like someone is stuck in a closet and you need to hear if their heart is beating in their ears, if they're afraid, if they're laughing, and we know that there's a monster coming, but they don't. You have to feel they're not being scared at all, and then all of a sudden something jumps out. We have to feel like the sweat running down their back. We have to smell what's happening. All of it has to be happening to the character in a way that the reader is following right along with the sensations.
Yeah, something you put it really succinctly to me like a couple years ago, Erin. And I think what you said was, if you want to scare a reader, you have to scare your characters.
Yes.
And it's like there's a lot of ways to show a character being scared, like anything from like, I don't know. And sometimes, like, I think when I try to do it, sometimes I feel like I'm too on the nose. It's like you have like, the hair prickling up on the back of their neck, or like I'm constantly describing people's heartbeat. And I feel like in your writing, you have like way like cooler and more subtle ways of doing that a lot of the time. And I'm jealous.
Well, it mostly comes from just observing people who are uncomfortable, because the hair prickling up on the back of their neck and the sweat and that stuff we know about. But like, we also know what nervous tics are when we see them. Someone is talking, but they can't stop scratching their arm. We want to comfort them. That is a fear. So if you're describing these things, like if someone has their tic activated all the time, if you point to it at the beginning of the story with a small discomfort, like a guy somebody likes walks up and she's like, oh, hi, and she kind of scratches her arm, and we know whenever he comes she does that. Then if she's in the closet, somewhere near the middle of the book scratching the skin off her arm, we know exactly what she's feeling. So just all the little details, having them mapped out and knowing exactly what people do or feel or smell or taste or hear when they're terrified. And then when we name them in the right moment, our reader is feeling that terror right along with them.
And that's something we've talked about a lot in this podcast. I mean, Anton specifically is all about specifics.
It's all about details.
Yeah,
like the more you can give details, the more you draw the reader into the character. And in this case, once you've drawn them into the character, if the character is afraid, then the reader is going to be afraid, and then you've won writing then.
And you've brought a little blurb to read for us, right?
I did. I brought actually my first submission to the Murder Park After Dark magazine that we put out, which is like, I just have so much fun writing those. They're so short, so it's difficult, but it's great. And I wrote a story for the first one called Pay. And I wrote it because I thought it was funny to have two victims, your damsel in distress, but also the victim is the empty payphone booths we see on the street. They're everywhere. They're so neglected. They're gross. And they were so important to society for such a long time. And suddenly they weren't. What if they were mad about that? So I just thought it would be funny to write a story where one tries to get revenge or does get revenge on someone who is using a cell phone in their booth. So I wrote this, and I'm going to read a small segment of it from, I'd say halfway through the story, but they're very short stories. And I named the main character Melody after the main character that Daria writes when she writes her horrible, bloody stories, because I thought that would be funny too.
You love Daria.
I do. I really do. Okay, here we go. This is from Pay, a ghost story. Melody's heart banged against her chest like an angry animal and thudded in her ears. The man shifted position, his bulk bulging at the tinkling metal-framed door and blocking out the sounds of the city streets outside. And Melody noticed his fat, grubby hand was outstretched toward her, palm up, demanding. It was to be expected. Her eyes locked on his unchanging face. Melody slid the heavy purse strap off of her shoulder, but found it hard to hold with her trembling, faint-feeling arms, but she offered it anyhow, slowly reaching toward him. When he did not move, she let the strap slide off of her palm over his. It slid off and hit the ground with a weighty thud. So I'm going to start
That's
there.
details.
Yeah. She, this guy cornered her in a booth and she held out her purse thinking she was being mugged. He didn't respond. She slid it onto his hand and it fell off. Well, we have the dread. He's come into the booth. We have the terror, like, well, I don't know, he's come into the booth, but then like
it's in that moment, yeah.
But the horror is he doesn't want the purse.
Yeah.
And that fact is not, I don't state it. I just, she puts the purse on him. She does everything she can and it doesn't work. And now we're back to the horror and the dread again.
It's really bad.
What is happening?
Yeah.
So I had a lot of fun writing that for this.
So, and that goes into one of the questions we were asking ourselves when we, before we got on mic, was how do you build tension? And I think by using those specific details and revealing them slowly. I mean, I've heard people talk about horror as like a kind of a striptease where you're revealing details slowly as the story progresses. And that's part of what Anton and Jane, you guys said you liked about those stories was the slow reveal. So if you have those details and you have this slow pacing and this mounting tension, I mean, that's really how you're going to build that tension, is focus on details, have the character move through them slowly, discover things, give things to them bit by bit, and then get the turn.
Yeah. I mean, and you should be doing that in all writing. I mean, not just in horror. I mean, it should be all details to bring your reader in. But I think in horror, I think it's so paramount. I mean, it has to be there because your characters, I don't know, for whatever reason, like it's more focused on them because they have to be scared. The characters have to be scared. I think you have to pay more attention on the details that draws the reader in so that the reader is scared with them, I guess is the way to say it.
Yeah. And I want to segue too, because we're talking about horror writing, but if it wasn't a horror story, where does horror fit in? And it's such a huge genre, but we're talking about thrillers. Like when you bring horror into other genres, like where something that is a fantasy or is sci-fi or is noir even, the way that you can use these techniques to inject a bit of horror into a story that is not a horror story, it just makes it a lot meatier. It's fun.
Yeah, I've always found like dark fantasy to be a really tricky genre for like some of the reasons you mentioned earlier, because it's like if you're writing in a fantasy world or a sci-fi world, then the story doesn't have that same familiarity as a person from the real world going into a real phone booth on a real street. Like we all know what that looks like. But when you are also asking the reader to like be in this totally imagined world, it's like harder to scare them because they don't necessarily know
what's out of the ordinary.
Your world has to be well built at that point, because now you have to establish that in order for the characters to then be scared so that the reader is then scared.
Right. Yeah. And the things that they're afraid of need to be relatable, you know?
Well, so I have a really good example for a story that fits under speculative fiction that I think is also a horror story, which is George Saunders' The Red Bow. I don't know if anyone's read it. But the supernatural or speculative element is that the dogs and cats in this little town in America have suddenly gone, who knows, and have started killing people, have attacking people. But that's not really the horror. The horror is what happens to the village in response to this crisis. Right. And to me, it's so I don't want to give away more than that because y'all should read it. It's published on Esquire. And to me, that's what I love also about horror, is the way that it can be about not just the horror, but about all these other things as well.
I mean, I don't know anyone who has not seen or experienced being attacked by a cat or a dog at some point in their entire life. This is a very grounded fear that you have, and it's universal. But them all going nuts all at the same time, maybe not so universal. But yeah, it's like there is no monster, but there's still a horror to be experienced.
And then the response then is, because cats and dogs are also creatures that we love.
Yes.
Right? Like I love my little dog. And if he were to attack someone else, he's
who
7
cares if it's
pounds.
someone else?
Right. Yeah. I mean, he's
had
7
it
pounds.
coming.
He can't
Yeah,
do a
totally.
ton of damage. But that is a fear of mine, is what happens if he does attack somebody and then, someone's like, well, you have to put him down.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah,
so
that's-
anyway, so that's what the town is kind of wrestling with. And it's, once again, as usual in many of these kinds of stories, it's the humans who are the real horror.
For sure. Like the
true.
horror of having to put a loved one down or animal down is a horror. That is a terror. That is something that we don't like to think about, but it is a reality,
Yeah.
that happens every now and then. So yeah, it's really scary.
It is scary. That story you mentioned, Jane, reminded me of a story, Heart of a Dog by Mikhail Bulgakov. Have you read that one? It's like a satire. I don't know if it's like really meant to be a horror story, but it's like from the dog's perspective, it's really scary.
It
It's
is
like
really yeah.
it's basically like a lot happens it's sort of a really short novel. A lot happens, but basically a professor takes a dog off the street and turns him into a human. And it like describes like the operation like from the dog's perspective as he's like taken into this aristocratic home and he thinks everything's great, but there's like dread there because you know
Yes.
that like something's up. And then eventually he's like taken to this operating table and it's like it's really scary. But the cool thing that this story does is after the operation, the dog's POV is taken away and the whole rest of the story is told from like somebody else's perspective. So it's like you connect with this dog's identity for like half of the story and then it's like taken away. And that is like the horror of it, I think. It's not really what the story is about, but I think that aspect is really effective.
Wow. I know that this is not necessarily a horror per se, but one of the most horrifying stories or series that I've read is Thomas Harris, Silence of the Lambs
Sure.
and Hannibal. But I noticed that in these stories, at least the ones that include the female character, she is not threatened so much by the Hannibal, Starling. She's not threatened as much by Hannibal as she is by her colleagues. And while he is a monster in a cage, he's a monster in a cage, but the people around her are putting her in this cage and closing it in on the both of them throughout the entire series. And so when you want to talk about the idea of, the real monsters versus the more relatable, Hannibal is a psychopath and there are psychopaths, but they are rare. And Thomas Harris wrote him with red eyes, so this was a monster. But at the same time, her colleagues, there was a sort of mundane evil, like they were just jealous or they were just understanding or they were just misogynistic or they were just trying to get a promotion. There were the most mundane reasons for them to throw this woman, Clarice Starling, to the wolves here. The wolves were not the monster. And because we saw it happening even when she didn't realize what was going on or she refused to believe it, that tension build, that dread and the horror of this is actually being reality is very much there. So Hannibal is my favorite monster in that series, but the fear, the tension building is not him. He's a foregone conclusion. It's how she can fight the fence, the Victorian or Gothic walls of this house that are closing in on
He's
her.
very much the boogeyman of that.
He's
of
the
those stories.
boogeyman.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And we all know how much you like doing your Hannibal impression, Anton. Can we get a second of it?
No.
All right. Well, anyway, so we've covered a lot of stuff here. Like we said at the beginning of the episode, horror is massive. It's a whole genre. It's got subgenres. On the topic of horror, we would like to share some good news.
Nice turn.
I love it.
Turn.
So, Jane, what's going
So
on?
I sold a story. It's a horror story. Very thematically appropriate. It came out in the October edition of Flash Fiction Online. So you should go there and read it. The story is called Mr. Buttons.
Oh.
Mr.
Mr.
Buttons.
Buttons.
Mr. Buttons.
That's super exciting, Jane.
that's
Congratulations.
awesome.
Thank you.
Well-
We're drinking
well done.
champagne right now on air. By the
We
way.
are, yeah.
Spooky champagne.
Yeah.
And then we should also, Carter mention again, Murder Park After Dark.
Yep.
Yes.
Murder Park Volume 3 is open to submissions from the general public. There's like all the guidelines and stuff like that. on our website, and you can find the email to send your story to. Horror, dark fantasy, spooky sci-fi, whatever, under 2,000 words. You can kind of see on the site what exactly we're really hoping to read.
And Erin, thank you for coming. This has
thank
been
you
a lot of
for
fun.
This was so much fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erin.
So this was the horror episode. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
That's right. Stay scared. So that was the episode. This has been The Genre Hustle.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to The Genre Hustle. You can find us on our website, www.genrehustle.com, on Twitter @genrehustle, or on Instagram @genrehustle. Our podcast is available on all major streaming platforms, including YouTube. Be sure to like, subscribe, and send any feedback or suggestions our way. See you next time.